The time has come. Those that were born in the year that ends with a 5, particularly those that start with a 1, can now say they are turning that number this year. You know, the one that felt so far away for so long. In my case, 30. 3 whole decades yapping on this earth have flown by, each feeling faster and faster. I have to say, I'm not where I thought I'd be at 30, but it seems most people don't seem to be where they are at any of these age milestones. Luckily, after a few cheeky breakdowns, I'm finding it easier to process. It's also funny when you complain about your age to someone that's older than you. Amy, but you're so young. You've got your whole life ahead of you. Before the inevitable, try being my age comment comes along. But then again, I do this to the Gen Z, so I can't say much. I've heard a phrase that our 30s is like our 20s, but richer. While we all have different experiences, I wanted to embrace the more positive sides of entering a new decade. In this video, I look into what the OG philosophers have to say about embracing aging, using the time for growth and reset, as well as looking at why we actually feel the fear in the first place, on a neuropsychological level. If you're new here, I'm Amy Claire, and on this channel I try to understand human nature, philosophy and life stories to help me make sense of life and how we all get to where we are. Let's start with that sneaky little fear that creeps in every time someone asks, "So what are you up to at the moment? Where are you working? Seeing anyone?" Questions like this seem to get more loaded with each passing year. The ancient Stoic philosopher Seneca actually had some spicy thoughts about this. In his essay on the shortness of life, he points out that we don't actually lack time, we just waste it by worrying about wasting it. 'Tis relatable, I suppose, that when I think about it, one of my greatest fears is regret. Am I doing enough? Too much? My brain can be quite chaotic at times. But here's where modern neuroscience gets a little bit more interesting. Researchers like David Eagleman have found that our perception of time is linked to how much new information our brains are processing. When we're younger, everything is novel, so our brains are taking detailed mental snapshots, making time feel slower. By 30, our brains are basically going, yeah, we've seen this all before, and then start fast forwarding through the familiar parts. To add to that, I find I was a lot more in the moment as a kid, so time felt slower. Now it's always about what's coming next, which I am working on, but it's taking time. Ironically. And that fear about not being where we should be. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson, we've had a field day with this one. He mapped out the psychological stages we all go through. And turns out that crisis we're having is right on schedule. It's literally part of our psychological development, like puberty for the quarter-life crisis. Here's something wild that neuroscientists discovered though. Our brains don't actually finish developing until around 25. So technically, we've only been working with our final form brain for a few years by 30. It's like we've been playing a video game in beta, and now we finally have the full version installed. The prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain responsible for decision making and emotional regulation, is finally fully online. No wonder everything before felt like controlled chaos, particularly in my early 20s. And speaking of chaos, let's talk why philosophers like Kierkegaard were actually big fans of existential anxiety. He called it the dizziness of freedom. That overwhelming feeling where we realise that we've got options and time ahead of us. Sure, it's terrifying, but it's also where the good stuff happens. Now about that richer part of the 30s equation. And I'm not just talking about finally understanding one's tax code. Research in cognitive psychology shows that while our raw processing speed might slow down a bit, I tend to say I've run out of RAM, we actually get better at what's called crystallized intelligence. Basically, we get smarter about using what we know already. It's like trading in a sporty but unreliable sports car for something that actually knows how to handle the road. Studies from the Max Planck Institute show that our emotional regulation peaks in our 30s and 40s. Translation? We're finally getting better at not losing our minds over things that would have sent us spiraling in our 20s. That passive-aggressive email you might receive from your boss, 20-year-old us would have panicked and questioned everything. 30-year-old us, more likely to just mutter, whatever, and go grab a cup of tea. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum talks about how getting older gives us a better capacity for eudaimonia, that fancy Greek word for living well and authentically. It's not about having it all figured out, spoiler alert, no one does, but it's about being okay with the figuring out process. Again, I'm still very much working on this. So here's what all this philosophical and scientific wisdom boils down to. Turning 30 isn't so much about reaching some imaginary checkpoint as it is about entering your brain's golden hour. You know, that perfect lighting when everything just seems to look better and everyone posts it on Instagram. Yeah, that's basically our 30s, but for our minds. And I know some of you might be in your 30s or more and will be strongly disagreeing, but just leave me have my optimistic moment, okay? Think about it. We're entering this decade with a fully developed brain. Finally. Better emotional regulation, kind of, and enough life experience to know which battles are worth our energy, like fighting for the Smith machine in the gym in January. The ancient philosophers weren't just blowing smoke when they said wisdom comes with age. They were basically early neuroscientists, without the fancy MRI machines. And that fear we talked about at the start, turns out it's our brain's way of doing the system update. It's like our existential crisis is just our consciousness getting a little bit of a glow up. Remember how I mentioned not being where I thought I'd be at 30? Well, final plot twist, according to psychology, that's exactly where most of us should be, somewhere completely different from where our 20-year-olds thought. The real glow up of entering our 30s isn't about having everything figured out. It's about trading in that frantic 20s energy of trying to be everything to everyone for the much cooler 30s vibes of just being ourselves, but with better boundaries and hopefully better skincare. So here's to entering a decade where we finally understand why our parents always look so tired, because they were, where we get excited about air fryers and Tupperware, even though I got there at 26, and where we realise that maybe, just maybe, all those older people telling us you're so young aren't just trying to make us feel better, they're also trying to tell us to be more grateful and stop making them feel worse. And if you're watching this while having your own age-related crisis, congratulations, you're right on schedule. Whether you're approaching 30, well past it, or viewing it from the other side, remember that every philosopher worth their salt says the same thing. Life's biggest plot twist usually comes right after asking, is this it? Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more evidence-based overthinking. Until next time, this is Amy Claire, embracing nearly 30 with only a minimal amount of breakdowns, and a much better understanding of stocks and shares. Slightly.